Hello and welcome to the podcast. The BBC World Service, often described as one of the BBC's most important tools of soft power, is once again facing questions about its future funding. The service, which reaches audiences of around 320 million people worldwide, is paid for partly by the licence fee and partly by the government through the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The FO has now been told to make savings by the Treasury, and so it has told the BBC to prepare cuts of its own. But there's already been a series of recent budget cuts, with around 130 jobs lost and several language services reduced or merged. In what some might see as an inspired or desperate move, BBC executives are reportedly exploring whether parts of the World Service could be supported with funds from the UK's defence budget. It's a move that raises difficult questions about the line between public service broadcasting, foreign policy and national security, and has led to the last director of the World Service crying foul and saying she cannot support the initiative. There are few better to discuss the issue than Mary Hockaday, who is now the Master of Trinity Hall, Cambridge, but was, until 4 years ago, the former controller of BBC World Service English, and who was also an acting director of the World Service as a whole. Mary Hockaday, thank you for joining us. How serious a situation do you think the World Service is in? There are always negotiations and there's always things run up to the wire and etc., etc. But is this an especially difficult time, do you think?
Hello, Roger. Really good to be talking to you. Funding for BBC World Service, over the years and decades, it goes up, it goes down. There's no doubt at the moment that it is stretched, that it's really stretched. It's also no doubt that the need is really great. So in the run-up to the budget, which is coming soon, and knowing that, of course, at the moment, BBC World Service is funded by licence fee, but also partly by the Foreign Office, and therefore the budget is really relevant, it's not surprising that there are some really serious talks going on, and hopes that there'll be a really good, strong funding settlement for the BBC World Service.
Well, there are hopes, but I wouldn't bet on it myself. I mean, when you look at the situation that the country is in, you look at the cuts that the Chancellor-Check is looking for, there's this fundamental problem now, isn't there, which is that the World Service used to be funded almost entirely by grant in aid from the Foreign Office. Eventually, there's always the danger with that, of course, that the Foreign Office puts embassies before its own direct interest before the World Service. Then we moved into this situation where it's part funded from the licence fee, and the amount paid by the foreign goes down. And Tim, the Director General of the BBC, has consistently said it is basically unfair for the licence fee payer to be paying for something which they do not, on the whole, use, and that it can't go on for so long. Is there something fundamentally unfair, do you think, about the licence fee payer paying for the World Service?
So, you made a lot of points there, Roger. I mean, you're absolutely right. Times are tough and public funding is tight, and any organisation is having to make, really, really strong pitch for government funding. And that's what the BBC, I think, and BBC World Service are doing and are able to do, because the cause is great and the cause is clear. I mean, you're right. There was this really big shift in how BBC World Service was funded from purely, essentially, Foreign Office directed funds through to this phase of licence fee only, actually, for a period, a settlement with the BBC and the Conservative government some years ago. Then a return to an element of government funding through the Foreign Office again, to help boost particular languages of need, to help boost particular initiatives to combat disinformation. And so the situation for the recent years has been majority funding licence fee, but a sizable chunk through the Foreign Office. As the BBC funding overall through the licence fee has itself got tighter and tighter, not keeping up with inflation, the BBC as a whole having to make really significant cuts and reductions, the pressure on the licence fee gets tighter. So you can understand why the BBC, why Tim Davie is thinking again about what's proportionate funding. Personally, I wouldn't say that it's completely unfair to have any licence fee funding, because actually the British public does gain from BBC World Service? First of all the services, or the English services and many of the language service content, are actually available through BBC Sound, through the BBC website. Much of the journalism that's done for BBC World Service and the journalists who are employed around the world to provide some of that journalism, that content makes its way through into UK-based news services on the BBC, because the stories that need coverage, the context, the background, the reporting, that all finds its way through into domestic services as well. Plus, I would argue, and there's plenty of evidence for it in public opinion surveys, that actually many Britons, much of the British public, appreciates that there's a real benefit to Britain, to themselves, in providing this global good, in providing impartial, accurate, informative news services around the world.
But you see, the government keeps on saying this, and you hear people, Senate, Commons committees, and everybody say how wonderful it is. And then you have Director General talking about the potential of doubling the audience, reaching 1 billion people around the world at a time when you would think it's never been more necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the growth of that dictatorship that is China. I won't call the United States a dictatorship, but anyway, what we can see is people in their silos. There's never been a better time to make the case, in principle, I would have thought, for the World Service. And you have an ambitious Director General. And yet, at this very moment, we are contracting, actually. You look at the BBC's licence fee is what? You can argue it's lost about 30 to 40% of its true value over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
You could certainly see that the BBC's estimate of what it requires in Foreign Office funding is well ahead of what the Foreign Office is likely to offer. So we have good words in general, but people don't want to pay for it. And DG has been trying to make statements, for the last 6 months, pleading essentially for a greater investment in the World Service, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. I mean, is this just a fact of life in politics?
Well, I think, in one way, Roger, we're going to completely violently agree with each other here, aren't we? Which is that the need has never been greater. I mean, you've talked about China, Russia as well. These countries invest billions in their own external media services around the world, often in the developing world and the global south, with very, very different news values, if you want to call them that at all, that are far from accurate, impartial, much more, in a way, declaredly a promotion, a propaganda tool. You also can look right around the world, and in general, media, news are more controlled, repressed, restricted than ever before. Something like, 3/4 of the countries around the world, people do not have access to fully free and fair media.
And we should say at this point, by the way, that we've got an extraordinary number of journalists being killed around the world as well.
Absolutely. Killed and in detention. And it's absolutely not just journalists killed in war or conflict. There are journalists losing their lives because they are pursuing, drug cartels or environmental crime or pursuing corruption. It has never been a tougher time to be a journalist, and it's never been a tougher time to be trying to get impartial, good, strong, independent, accurate news to audiences. So,
in which case you think, well, it should never be a better time to ask the government for money, but they're clearly not. They're not going to get it. It's screamingly obvious that they're not going to get it. And I think what's interesting is the BBC's tactic now. I mean, having made the general case for quite some time and it not on the whole being that well received, is now going to the Ministry of Defence, which is a very interesting move. And it's arguing essentially that if we should think of security in this country in a different way, we should now think of food security for a start, energy security. But there's another form of security, and that is having access to or making sure that information is distributed around the world, which is accurate and, obviously exports those values to which but it would seem in decreasingly number of world countries espouse liberal democracy and so on. So the BBC, we know, is trying to argue that the Ministry of Defence budget, which is probably about the only one one of the few in Whitehall likely to go up, there's a source of funds. They're going to get more money. We'll try and get a bit of it. In principle, do you have any objection to that?
Well, if you look at the whole defence sector, foreign affairs, aid, defence, there's no doubt that there's a very different kind of conversation than there was decades ago. You know, we've all got used to phrases like hybrid warfare. We've all come to understand that security can be a matter of, you know, the digital universe just as much as a sort of traditional sense of kind of guns and warships. And there's a kind of broader conversation about security, which I think the BBC has realised it can have a voice in. For me, the most important thing in all of this is almost wherever the money comes from, that the principles of independence, editorial independence, are absolutely sacrosanct. So that was always the case when the BBC was funded by the Foreign Office. You know, I would travel the world with BBC World Service, and I would go places and I would meet people in perhaps, you know, less than fully democratic governments or media organisations. They would say, oh, yes, well, we're the state broadcaster and you're the state broadcaster too, aren't you? How marvellous. And I would say, no, we are not the state broadcaster. We are a public broadcaster. Yes, our money is public money coming to us through a department, through the Foreign Office, but it is approved by Parliament. We are regulated by Charter. And crucially, the government of the day has no direct control over our editorial content.
Now, interesting that you said they used the word direct control here. And I wonder if you're slightly overstating the case about independence, because the government basically decides to whom you would broadcast.
They would decide, you're right, they would decide the language services. So we would propose which languages we wanted to broadcast in, they would approve or not. But I'm quite happy to take the word direct out of it. They had no editorial control over the content of the services.
Except that, and I'm sure that, you know, I've met many people at the World Service who passionately hold on to that and do believe it. But the fact is, you know, whoever pays for you does expect to have some influence, and the government pays for you. So that's in the background. The other thing, of course,
Roger. I don't agree. I mean, I agree. You know, you're absolutely right about a conversation where you're determining which languages it's regarded as valuable to broadcast in. But editorial, I mean, I never felt that pressure. I never took a call. It just wasn't the case because, and this is again a really, really important point to make, and I think is again the essential point, almost wherever your sources of funding come from. Fortunately, very, very fortunately, we live in a country where the public, but also governments of any stripe, have always regarded it as a credit to the country that we have independent, regulated, fair, impartial, free journalism, and that it is a credit to the country, and indeed actually to any government of any stripe, to be supporting that. And that if you hold on,
Mary, hold on. That's right in principle, and it's broadly right. But the number of times that from Harold Wilson to Mrs. Thatcher and subsequently, prime ministers have said to the chairman of the BBC we must do something about the BBC. I mean, there has been intense pressure, and there always is intense pressure when the charter is renewed and when the licence fee comes up.
Of course, and it's the job of any Director General and BBC editors to resist that pressure.
Let me put another example to you, which I question mark to you, which is, I've been a bit provocative deliberately of this, but when you look at the monitoring services of the BBC, it's a bit more complicated, isn't it? The World Service obviously benefits, as does the whole of the BBC, from monitoring the operation which listens in and records what's being said around the world. But the BBC, of course, is only one recipient of that information. The other recipient is the Government Foreign Office stroke MI6. And that's been a very close and not on the whole not well publicised relationship. So just this environment surely has an effect not on the individual journalism involved, but upon the basic approach.
No, again, let me push back on that. I mean, you're absolutely right that BBC monitoring has a particular function. It monitors open source sources around the world, you know, media content being produced by all sorts of, you know, governments in all sorts of languages. And that's a very useful resource, an information resource, which again is available both to BBC journalists, but also to all sorts of customers, actually, and indeed government and through funders. But it's a separate part of the organisation. It's not part of the main BBC editorial, and its function is understood and its function is separate. But going back to this basic point about how Of course, there are sometimes, tensions and tussles between government and BBC. It kind of goes with the territory. But the fundamental commitment, both through the charter, all the regulation, and actually, in the end, the custom and practice of respect for the independence of the BBC being kind of hardwired in, is also what is valued by the public. And it's also what you see leading to the credit coming back to the BBC amongst BBC World Service audiences. When you do surveys with public people around the world who do consume BBC, one of the huge reasons that they respect the BBC is the independence and the accuracy of the journalism. And if you then ask them how that affects their opinion of Britain, it goes up. What it does to their sense of whether they might want to travel to Britain, invest in Britain, perhaps seek education in Britain, all of this goes up. Whether they indeed consider being more engaged as citizens and civic involvement in their own countries where that's possible, it goes up. So you can see these markers that demonstrate that what the BBC, what Britain is doing through BBC World Service, has real benefit as a public good and brings credit back to Britain.
Are you saying, in effect, or do you think that this is whether we support the World Service financially properly is a test of whether we want to play a role in the world? Because there are some people who say there's a growth of nationalism going on, there's a growth of isolationism, that in some way we have lost the belief and the will to be an international player in some form. Is that exaggerating it?
Yeah, I would. And what I would also say, I don't actually think Britain has completely lost its will and desire to be a player in the world. And, we can list so many ways where that's just obviously true. And Britain remains extremely engaged and in some areas, wants to be and is proven to be even more engaged and plays an incredibly important role. The thing I would say is that actually through BBC World Service, it's an extremely efficient way to do that. Media is, compared to many other things, and actually, compared to kind of, tanks, relatively economical. And
well, it is, we're having this generalised discussion. And when you look at the sums involved, the government actually for 2025-26, the government funding went up to 137 million. Now, 137 million in government terms isn't even a peanut. It's bizarre, this, isn't it?
It's not that much, is it? No, it's not that much. And actually, when you look at these sort of brand trackers, I hate to do this, I'm sorry, football fans out there, but, the BBC gets even more name recognition than the Premier League. I mean, it's an incredible brand because it's an incredible product, an incredible asset. I mean, that's, of course, not just BBC World Service. That might be your Doctor Who episodes or whatever. But the BBC is so highly regarded and trusted. When you look at surveys showing trust in media, the BBC is the most trusted global news brand. And
although the figures are going down, unfortunately, in this country anyway.
They are, because they're going around for all media around the world because we live in a more kind of fragile ecosystem. But the BBC is the best, and that's really true in the United States as well, which is quite remarkable.
Okay, let's go back to the question of the specific politics of the funding at the moment and this attempt to get money out of the MOD effectively. The former director of the World Service, she only stood down a year or so ago, Lillian Landor, we contacted her and she said she was deeply concerned about the operational capacity of the World Service if additional cuts continue to work in it further. But she said about the specific getting money from the MOD, I find myself wholly unable to support the BBC's decision to pursue this advance. Journalism cannot be linked or subordinated to defence, and dare I say, even soft power can be problematic, despite my past advocacy of it. We journalists know that journalism is about pursuing the truth, maintaining independence of thought, and holding power to account, however uncomfortable the results may be. So I absolutely understand, and you will understand her concerns. But you don't share them ultimately. Is that because you think the situation is so desperate we have to have the money, or do you have somehow faith in the MOD that they won't overstop the mark?
So I would share those concerns. And again, it's why I emphasise what really, really matters is not exactly where your funding has come from. I mean, we haven't talked about commercial funding, for instance, which actually is not something BBC World Service has. But I mean, there are plenty of very strong public service broadcasters who are commercially funded. You have to explain how you maintain editorial independence if you are commercially funded. You have to explain how you are independent journalistically through regulation and through the proof of the pudding, which is the content, if you have funds from the Foreign Office. I mean, I think the conversation with or around defence is a tricky word. Security is a word where I think there is a kind of legitimacy to a conversation. And as I understand it, and I'm not, party or privy to the detailed conversation at all, as I understand it, there is a conversation which is pointing out that activity by the BBC World Service, which is specifically focused on disinformation, has a relationship to security, which makes for a legitimate conversation. So it's not that I'm sort of glib or think that, there shouldn't be a lot of really careful thought about this. But I do think in a world where issues around security, brackets including defence, but in a more rounded sense, both of civil resilience, but also international and global security, as that conversation gets broader, as, yes, of course, you have to have some pragmatism about where sources of funding might come from. These conversations are worth having, but it's really important, if they go anywhere, that the safeguards are there, that the commitments and the mechanisms for the independence are there. But that has always been the case. And those of us who've worked with World Service for some time have moved from Foreign Office funding to licence fee funding and made that argument, and then to a hybrid funding model again. And that, so it's about really holding on to the fundamentals, making the case, but having the right mechanisms and regulation that would secure that in any arrangement going forward.
Now, let's be pessimistic. We often are, I'm afraid, or I am. Maybe I'm a half-glass empty person by nature. But anyway, let's assume that the BBC doesn't get the settlement it wants. That's a fairly safe assumption, but let's do it. It's not a good one. Now, you were head of the BBC newsroom between, 2009 and 14, and you merged the news operations. So a lot of the things that people might say were in the past duplicated in the BBC with the World Service are not now. But the price of that has been a sort of integration, hasn't it? So when you actually want to take significant sums of money effectively out of the World Service, must be extraordinarily difficult to do. And the other second question related to that is, who has the right to decide about these changes? I mean, the government decides ultimately where the World Service should broadcast. Supposing the BBC says, well, hold on, here you are, you've got a choice. We've worked this out. You either stop broadcasting here or you stop broadcasting there, whatever. And there's a bit of me which thinks that's undemocratic. That's a government decision, not a BBC's decision. So, I find it very difficult to see, A, how you get the money out because of the integrated operation, and secondly, worried about whether you should be taking, or the BBC should be taking decisions that actually is for government. Are these real worries?
So, two things there. And yes, of course they are. I mean, the BBC and BBC World Service has been going through this for some years. It has been having to take money out frequently. And I mean, there have been further cuts just in the last couple of years in World Service. And as ever, it is always a mixture of doing what you can to be more efficient and effective, to doing what really, really matters and perhaps letting a few of the nice to haves go, and then coming to decisions which are really, really painful. So, for instance, the decision to move broadcasting of BBC Arabic on radio to an end and moving to a digital service alongside, of course, BBC Arabic television, really, really difficult decision made in the light of changing audience habits. I mean, a rational decision, but a painful decision. And painful then to see that actually, Russia picked up some of the channels and broadcasting frequencies and is making good use of them. So, of course, if there are further cuts, there will be tough and difficult decisions. I mean, I have every confidence, just as I've saw it through the last decade or so, I have every confidence that BBC colleagues and BBC World Service will continue to maintain an absolutely outstanding service of accurate and impartial news across channels and languages, as it has always done at whatever funding level it has. But it is really, really painful to see a reduction in services or a reduction in the number of journalists on the ground in particular countries, or a reduction in the breadth of the editorial mix, which is also what's been inevitable.
Of course, if you try and, you've got to be careful as well in the negotiations that you don't get the government to feel it's being blackmailed and that, you're sort of, that's tricky. But you must feel if we're getting nowhere, we must get the story out into the press. We must get people to think, do they really want to lose this? Yeah. So there's that problem of negotiation. But actually, within the mixture of funding now and what happens within the BBC, the efficiencies that have been developed by amalgamating services means that it gets increasingly difficult in certain areas, doesn't it? To say, well, that's clearly World Service money and that's license fee money. It's
tricky, but it is not impossible. And actually, there's a lot of good work done by colleagues in the finance team, perhaps not, rather than the journalists, to be able to articulate where funding has come from and what it is paying for. So it's tricky, but it's absolutely not impossible. But it goes back to a point I made earlier on that, if you reduce World Service funding, which then perhaps does reduce the number of journalists working in particular countries or particular languages, ultimately, that can diminish the journalism being consumed on Radio 4 or BBC One or the BBC website. It can thin out the overall editorial mix.
And we also have a situation where a lot of those journalists are under pressure in their countries. I mean, we know that China, for example, has been that families related to journalists to China have been under pressure. That's happened around the world.
And that's true with Iran. Yeah. That's very, very true with our BBC.
So it's some of the toughest times to be a journalist for the BBC in another country other than Britain. And at that same time, the resources are cut back and so on.
I mean, you raised the point, Roger, also about, who ultimately makes the decisions if there are reductions to be made. And you're right that if the BBC wishes to reduce or, close a language service, that would be a conversation with the Foreign Office. But it would be for us to propose, it would be for the BBC, so I shouldn't say us, I don't work there anymore, for the BBC to propose. And actually, the BBC recently did launch, or perhaps I should say relaunch a service in Polish to, again, specifically combat issues of disinformation there. So the BBC has the agency, but yes, of course, depending whether funding comes from, there are conversations to be had.
The final question to you really is, I suppose, one of tactics. The BBC on the whole, and I think it's a measure of the period under this Director General, and certainly with the last government, is to say there's no point making a fuss. We just have to get on and demonstrate to government that we're extremely efficient and we do this, whatever. We're not going to get anywhere if we complain. And I think he's got a remarkable record, actually, as far as I can see, with reduced revenue of making cuts which haven't been really damaging. And he's a much more efficient organisation in many ways. But there comes a point, and I think it's throughout the BBC, where you think the BBC is starting to cut things which actually we as the public, the licence fee payer, should be consulted about. And the danger for me it is that the BBC has prepared itself for a life either without the licence fee or with a reduced licence fee, with developing its business, particularly in the United States, and trying to create a big business which will survive, without a widespread discussion in society about what public service should be or what we think it can be in the future. No discussion, as far as I'm aware, about the role of the arts that the BBC can play. The same about music and other things. Actually, in terms of the World Service, not much of an argument about the role we want British and British values to play. Obviously, it's a tactical decision, but I wonder from the BBC, but I wonder whether we're now, with the Charter coming up for renewal elsewhere, we actually need a much wider debate than that.
No, I think it's right. It's really good to be having this conversation, and I think it is right and good. I don't completely agree with you, Roger, because actually, every now and then the Director General makes really important speeches, or not just him, senior BBC execs, they're cropping up at the key conferences, they're writing in the papers and making these points, but in a focused way. And I think that's been done both about the BBC's, contribution to the creative industries, the BBC's contribution broadly and in this country to journalism and the public square, and indeed now globally. So I think it's important to have these discussions, and you would expect at a point where you're either coming up, in the context of particular budget discussions or negotiations, or indeed as things then build up to the Charter, that actually that broader public conversation is really important. And I know the BBC will want that conversation to happen, because in the end, the BBC is the public's. You know, we're talking about this, and that at heart is absolutely fundamental. And I think, given the state of the world, I mean, it's always been the case, but given the state of the world at the moment, the case for a really strong public square for a space where everybody can have access, whether they're in this country or abroad, to accurate, fair, impartial journalism, great entertainment that is homegrown as well as produced by the megaliths around the world, really great education, strong children's programming, never been more important.
Finally, do you miss it? I mean, do you wish you were in negotiations now? You've got a fabulous job, it would seem to me, but is there a bit of you that thinks, it's like footballers retired a fraction too early? No?
Well, you're right. I have a very wonderful role at the moment. It's an absolute privilege. I'll tell you what I do miss. On a really big news story day, I kind of get these little tingles in my fingers, and I just imagine what it's like being in the newsroom with everybody kind of pulling together and, humming and grappling with the story and creating great content. Do I miss budget meetings? I don't know, Roger. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, anyway, for coming out of your many meetings in Cambridge for this interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Mary Hockaday, the former controller of BBC World Service English. Now, if you'd like to support us, you can do so for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Just head to patreon.com/BeebWatch and sign up for £1.99 a month. You'll also receive my weekly blog where I share some reflections on the week's interview. And that's all for this week. This podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon, with sound by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.